Welcome to the Mysticism and Spirituality podcast on the X-ile network. Your hosts are Reverend Dr. Todd Seelau, Reverend Jon Moore, and Reverend D.G. Hollums. We invite you to join us as we explore meditative and contemplative practices that will enrich this journey and adventure that we call life.
Hey everybody, welcome to X-ile's Mysticism and Contemplation and Spirituality kind of conversation. We don't have a name for it yet, we're working on it. That's why I struggle with, with what to call it. But I'm happy that you're here with us, and Jon here is with me again. Jon, do you want to give just a quick introduction or tell how your week went? How about if we start with that? Since everyone knows you from last week, because everyone's very vigilant listener.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Jon Moore here. I'm the pastor in downtown Albuquerque at First United Methodist Church and Community of Hope, new church plant. We're actually recording this on a Sunday afternoon, so I'm freshly completed Community of Hope this afternoon. And I mean, it's an amazing worship experience, community event. Had a great the worship's like half an hour. The message I share, I hardly even call it preaching, because it's just like, here's the scripture and let me reflect on some things that really matter in real life. And then we sort of finish up on purpose, so there's room for people to have conversation with me. And I just had some really cool conversations with some folks, about the things we were talking about and just their lives and sort of what they're dealing with and their perspective on things and experiences that they've had in life, and just kicking back in the courtyard of the church I serve, and gathering the community around. And it was just that was a great end of the week, and had some time to do some fun stuff with my family. So it's been a good week on my end, and if you count all those good things as spiritual, which I do, then it was a fairly good week spiritually as well. I probably wasn't the most disciplined this week, but that's okay.
I did. I was trying to incorporate prayer and reading. I guess study, they would call that, right? Richard Foster would call it study. And I do pretty well with fasting. I did a good job fasting this week, and I did a pretty good job reading. I was reading a couple of things that I'll talk about, because we kind of left off last week about resources. And so I was kind of looking into some resources and seeing kind of where to start, trying some things out. But I didn't do the prayers I was wanting to do much at all, or having a discipline with that at all. And I thought about it a lot, felt guilty about it, an appropriate amount, but I didn't actually do it very much. One morning though, I woke up, and I think it was on the September 2nd, whatever day that was. I woke up, and Shane Claiborne and I forget his buddy's name, but they were doing like a prayer, kind of a morning prayer thing, and I guess they do it once a month on the 1st on their Facebooks, and it was cool. They were saying some prayers and they were singing, and it was pretty cool. And so I kind of participated in that prayer that morning, and that was cool. But I think that I kind of need a book or a resource or something, or a website or something that I can an app that I can just this is the first thing I do, and kind of make it part of a morning routine or something that I can do right away. And so So I did pretty good with a couple of things, did pretty bad with a couple of things. But I'm going to keep working on it. I'm going to get my prayer down, and we can talk about more of those resources and kind of where to start. I can talk a little bit about where I've started, and a couple insights I kind of got from that too, and we can kind of just start with that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Do you want me to, let me lift up a prayer as we begin.
Let's start with that.
Because, even with your comments, Todd, I remember DG last week, the last podcast, really kind of chiming in at one point and reminding me and all of us about the importance of community in spiritual disciplines and spiritual practice. And I really think that's like a really important element for a lot of us. Because like you, Todd, like I'm an extrovert. I grew up in the United Methodist Church, but also surrounded by a lot of pretty conservative evangelical expressions. Like I went to a lot of really conservative youth groups. They ranged from conservative Presbyterian to Southern Baptist to non-denominational, independent charismatic, just a whole lot of different youth experiences. And I came of age, and Todd and I are really close in age, so we came up at the same time. But I mean, I remember the emphasis on, have your personal quiet time with God every morning. In a week or two, when we start talking about specific practices, we're actually going to talk about Lectio Divina, which is sort of the old precursor to that whole 80s evangelical quiet time. And what I've learned since then is, I think in the way I was taught to do quiet time, it was very focused on, being in the Word and spend that time and do that thing. But I think it missed some of the spiritual dimensions of where that should lead you or what you should do with it. And so, like, I read a lot of scripture, kind of, and tried to pray a lot, and had devotional books, and really, I mean, kind of sucked at it. And still to this day, I'm not real good about that diligent go off on my own and spend all this time. I'm actually better now than I ever have been, as my own journey towards like contemplative spirituality and mysticism has finally filled in the gaps about what to do with that time and like the spiritual side of it. And it's a lot less about even how much time I take or when I do it, or sort of what I do in that time, and a lot more about what happens behind the scenes, which might sound elusive, but I know we're going to, keep unpacking that kind of stuff as we go. So I picked out a prayer for today that as happens in the spiritual life, I feel like it sort of dovetails into some of those themes. And so I want to lift this up. This is a prayer by Howard Thurman, who is one of the lead African-American mystics of the 20th century, also a great advocate for civil rights and social justice, and a whole lot of things. And this is one of his more famous prayers. And so I want to use this prayer from Howard Thurman to start our time, or to early in our time this week. So pray with me. Lord, open unto me. Open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me. Amen.
That's good. I like that. I want to. It makes me think about what if this really were like prayers have always really been like words to me, and hopes, and like, hey, I hope this happens, or God do this, and then hope God does it, right? Like, but what if like it really happened? And I've been thinking a lot about that lately. Like, what if it really, what if these things really happened and our lives were open? Because we only kind of take on as much as we think we can take on, right? And then some stuff is put on us. like on top of it. And then we're like overwhelmed and we're doing more than we ever thought we could. But, we stop taking things on when we're full, or when we have too much grief, or we have too much sorrow, or we have too much, guilt, or whatever it is. Like we stop pushing forward. And then when we deal with some of that stuff, or some of that goes away, or we feel like a relaxation from it, we tend to then that's when we kind of push and take on more and try something else. And so if God really did open us to these things, right, and replace those things with those other things, right, replace, really gave us a sense of forgiveness, and replace our guilt with forgiveness, and replace, our sorrow with joy, like that, what does that do? And that frees us up to do a lot more, right, than just kind of holding on to it. And so I think these prayers have really practical implications. And if there's a way for them to actually happen, like if we're feeling sorrow, we're feeling these things, like what would happen if they really just went away, and that's very, I hope other people feel that way. I hope it's not just me, but I've always, when I pray for God to do stuff. Pray for God to do stuff to me, and I don't exactly expect it to happen, or I expect it to happen in God's way, or in God's time, or all the things that people say about why you don't get results sometimes, or you don't feel results sometimes. And so I don't try to put those expectations on God to actually do those things, but what if I did? And what if I believed that it would happen? And what if I really pushed it, and I pushed God on it, and what if I did my part, to make that happen too? What could happen? And that made me think of that, and it's super, super interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that prayer. The reason I sort of prefaced it with, you talked a little bit about your struggles, and I mean, just this sort of ongoing awareness that, in some ways my practice is more rich than it has ever been, but all the way through, I really struggled with, like my own expectations and the expectations of other people, not God's expectations, but like my expectations and what I was told it should look like, and what I needed to do, right? That it was all like, this is how I need to be a spiritual person, and I need to do this. And it's not that I don't think discipline's important, but I think there's a real shift in a prayer like that one of Thurman's that is so clearly, God, all of this depends upon your move. And I absolutely expect it from you, but I'm also really clear. I mean, there's really nothing in that prayer that's like, so I'm going to do this, and then I want you to do that, or I promise to do this, or it's not even help me do these things. It's really interesting because it's very transformative. It is action-oriented prayer, but it's also at the same time very much a prayer of being. The action is all on God's part, and it's all just this action of opening. Like, God, if you would just open this stuff up in my life or towards me, that makes all the difference. And it's such it puts me in a really different stance, I guess, inwardly in my spirit, in terms of my spirituality and what I need to do and what God needs to do. And it really firmly puts God in God's seat and me not in God's seat. And I really like that, because I think any forward motion, really relies on the initiative of the divine, which I think God is always the one making the initiative. And it's, I think it's much more about God, like, help me catch on, because it's not like you're remote or you're not attentive or doing things. You're already always on the move toward us and involved. Like, you got to open it up for me, because I'm the one who's constantly unaware, or I'm living as though, those things aren't true. And if I look for that and believe, like you were saying, Todd, a little bit more in those things, and just the last two lines really caught me in that prayer. open unto me thyself for myself, which you can take that in a couple different ways, which is really interesting. Both kind of like, God is for me, especially out of Thurman's context, but also like, less of me and more of you, God, and Lord, open unto me, just you. So
Yeah, that's cool, man. I like it. It makes me think a lot. So, do you have any resources that you would suggest people kind of start with if you're just starting to get into this? Like, I mean, I've been kind of curious about this for a year, been dabbling.
Yeah.
Read Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, which is good.
Yep.
Which is good.
Yeah, yeah.
Overviews all sorts of different spiritual disciplines, which I think is really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And Foster's work, there's an app and a whole website called Renovare, which is like his ongoing work. It's the small group expression of some of his writings, and there's still some motion in that community and some of those elements. So, and that's like a great resource for just kind of. Was that Renovare? I think there's a apostrophe over the last E.
Okay.
And I think we can also, Todd, can we? I don't want to speak out of turn because this is kind of your thing, and I'm the invited guest. But
no.
I think we're gonna post up some links or some materials too, right? We can sort of spell that out for people. And I was just bringing that up to let people know, hey, if you don't catch some of the stuff we say quickly.
Yeah, look on the YouTube if you're watching it on YouTube. But if you're listening to it on the podcast, it's harder. So I wanted to make sure we get both, just in case. But yeah, we'll put the stuff on the YouTube and on the description. We'll put links and maybe if you can do that on the podcast channel. We're on a bunch of different channels. And so I think they're all kind of different, but if we can put some of that on the main channel or something, per each episode, we can do that. But I'm just not sure how that works yet.
Cool. Okay.
But yeah.
And sounds good. Yeah. And Richard J. Foster, I'm sure if you just Google his name, Celebration of Discipline, is that the one you read, Todd? That's sort of the signature. Yeah. I think that'll lead you to all the other stuff that's sort of connected to his name. And I think, that's a really good starting point for a good hodgepodge of different classic disciplines and in some different categories. So I think that's really helpful.
While we're talking about that, before you answer the question I asked you, I started reading. This is just a good segue because his student, I forget his first name now. James Bryan Smith wrote 3 books. The first one's called The Good and Beautiful God. Then there's A Good and Beautiful Life, The Good and Beautiful Spirit, something like that. I'm not sure. But it's a trilogy. And a buddy of mine lent this book to me, and I started to read it this week because I said I would try to start reading these things. And as I was reading it, I read the introduction, and it basically says that the way this book is meant to be read is kind of in a community or a small group. And so I wonder if does this have something to do with that small group, that app that you were talking about, and that group you were talking about?
Yeah, it probably does, actually. And I think that's most of the resources that we're going to look at in the spiritual disciplines. I think, I don't know, this might be too general a thing to say, but as I think through some of the things that I've used and some of the things that I know we're going to talk about and that I'm going to be sharing as we go forward, most of them can be used both as an individual discipline. So you can do it fully off by yourself. If you don't have people around that can support you or you're not sure, you can use it by yourself and it'll be, a really rich experience. I think simultaneously, though, every single one of these disciplines also works well in a group setting. And just doing it with other people is a little bit of a different experience. And then, of course, one of the greatest values of doing things in a group is to hear how other people are experiencing things, to sort of share what's difficult. I mean, kind of like at the start of this conversation, right, Todd? You were like, yeah, things didn't go real well. I'm like, well, yeah, welcome to my whole story. Here you asked me to be part of this because I've learned some things, but it's the old phrase, one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. I mean, it's not, it's not that I do this so well that you can learn from that, but it's like, I'm not great at some of these things, and yet still I find some things that I have discovered recently to really be making a difference. And it's not still perfect every day, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about more of that as we go.
Sure.
But I think
if anybody's interested in like starting a group and reading these together or something as we listen to this or as we go on, like I'm totally down to do that. We start a Facebook group or something and kind of work through it together. But there's so much stuff to read. I don't want to read a group book like now when there's a bunch of other stuff that'd be better suited for me to read on my own. So turn to some other things. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this was Richard Foster and Willard. What's his name? Dallas Willard's student. I'm terrible.
Oh yeah,
terrible. And so he wrote these, and he really kind of started this small group kind of experience. And so if anybody's interested, it seems like a pretty cool kind of very basic spirituality kind of series to go through. And I didn't really look at it much, so I'll be right on the same page with y'all. But if a few people want to get together and start something like this, we can talk about it. So hit me up if that's interesting to anybody. But so now back to the question. What are some? Where would you start, or where would you tell people are some good places to start? I'm gonna turn this light off.
Sure. So I think one of the things we talked about last time, Todd, was sort of in general, what is like Christian mysticism. I remember you asked me to define it, and DG's not on this call, so you asked him to define it, and he didn't define it, which is fine, because actually some of these things are really hard to put into a sentence. It's the direct experience of God, and it's the way people experience God and then share that, and it groups up in some common threads. But how do you define that? I mean, part of the whole deal with
mystery, right? Like that idea of mystery, which is super important in these conversations, because the more we try to nail it down, the less we start limiting things that aren't supposed to be limited.
Yeah, and that's exactly the deal, right? I mean, in mysticism, you're having these experiences that, by definition, are really, not just hard to define, but really evade definition. It is the mystery. It's these, it's why certain brands of mysticism will refer to God by titles like, the ineffable one, which you tend to find in in the Kabbalah and those sort of resources, which, to me it's not about a depersonalizing of God, but it really is about confessing that the more we feel like we get deeper in a relationship with God, the more God gets hard to, describe. The more we get to know God, the more we understand, there are parts of God I cannot wrap my head around. I cannot know. I cannot know intimately. I grew up on the whole personal relationship. There are aspects of God that completely defy any sort of personal experience or description. And so I think that's we're looking for words together in a community to try to, I think, really not define things so much as chart enough of the course so other people can find their own way to walk in it, and you need some sort of map or some sort of direction to walk, in a different direction if it's new for you. And that's about all we can do is give enough lay of the land so people can sort of head in that direction on their own. So for
I think
yeah.
right. Once we start to talk about God, we've already limited God to our language and what we can write. And so like that whole idea of even talking about God, and Peter Rollins write how not to talk about God, right? He has that book.
Yeah.
Which also reminds me of that. And like there was stuff very challenging about Karl Barth that I learned about that challenged me a lot. But there's some of that stuff I really like. Like I really like some of the stuff that he said. And so I like that. And ineffable could be a good name for this show we're doing, right? And
Maybe, yeah. And I gravitated toward that phrase because it's just your God is beyond my ability to really talk about in so many ways.
Yeah,
and I'm still going to try.
Yeah,
and we can, but at some point, I think there's some really important humility in saying all my words and all my conceptions ultimately come up short.
Yeah,
and I think a Christianity that can't hold that stance of humility is just going to end up being too arrogant for its own good.
Yeah, and coming up short is our specialty.
Right? Yeah, we're supposed to. Because if we don't, then we don't need God, right? I mean, if we're not coming up short, what's the point?
Exactly. I love it, man. I love it. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I like that too. I think that's really a good word in this conversation. Like I'm on here because I know some stuff, but the truth is, I also know I really come up short, and so I'm willing to give the answers I have, knowing that they're finite answers. They're not complete. They could never be complete, knowing that other people are going to have really different experiences.
Yeah.
And I'm okay, if like your experiences don't have to match up to mine, or my stuff doesn't have to work for everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not that smart. So in terms of like the concept of mysticism in general, though, and like what is that and who is that? Like who are the mystics, and how did that come about? What are just some contours of it? There's a guy named Carl McColman, and I pulled the book off my shelf while Todd was talking about something else, and this is I went in the wrong direction. The big book of Christian mysticism. Man, we should post this up on his blog so that he can give us credit for pointing people out to him. There's his name, Carl McColman. So he's got books, but he also is a blogger, and he's on Patheos, and so you can find his ongoing blogs. He's fairly active on Twitter, and will actually post some stuff on Twitter. And so he's got an active blog, so he's still writing. You can actually get in touch with Carl. He's a pretty cool guy.
Wow.
But he does just a great job, and the blog on Patheos is all about sort of mysticism and Christian mysticism specifically. But he's just, he's got such a generous soul in a non-judgmental way, and he really explains things while keeping to the mystery of it, and is just really well acquainted with the personalities and the history and the development of that whole scenario. And so he's kind of my go-to guy to say, hey, if you just want to get familiar, or even get lined up with somebody who's continuing to put stuff out, in a couple different formats, depending upon how much time you have and what you want to get into. I think Carl's probably one of the best ones we have right now at going there and doing things in terms of Christian mysticism.
That's awesome. Is that pretty easy to read? It's a good shallow end. I'm looking for shallow end of the pool stuff. Right, this is a very deep ocean, right?
Yeah, no, he's very accessible, but I think he's accessible, but he also doesn't shortchange you on the depth. I think it's depth, but it's not hard going. He's clear about a really muddy topic, but yeah, no, I think like I enjoy him, but I would also send people that are really not familiar with the concepts. Even people that don't have like a whole lot of Christian vocabulary, don't know what we're talking about all the time out there. Carl's like really good at
that's awesome.
meeting you where you are. Yeah,
that's awesome. Good. What else? What else if I'm like, hey, I want to dabble in this, or I want to get to know what this is like, right? What are some other places you might go to?
Yeah, so it's a name that's used a lot, but I still direct people to Thomas Merton.
Oh yeah,
who
he's one of my
also is, yeah.
Well,
Merton's phenomenal. He's no longer with us, but is real recent, kind of a contemporary voice and author, and so it feels relevant. He's also really honest about sort of his own struggles, and that's one of the things that drew me to Merton in the first place.
Yeah, and he messes stuff up a lot, and I relate to that. Like he's super messy and he gets kicked out of meetings, and he gets in trouble, and I love it. He's super honest about it, and he's a great writer, too, and so it helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a poet as well, and some of his poetry is pretty amazing. That's probably the least known part of him. Like a real eye for nature and seeing spiritual things in nature, and then also, I mean, he was just a champion of creating bridges between Buddhism and Christianity. And in fact, died in an untimely way through a freak electrocution accident while he was overseas attending a huge conference between Buddhism and Christianity. Wow. And trying to build understanding and common ground. Always, like, he was always clear, his standpoint was Christianity, but also always willing to build a bridge and say, this is really different for us, but over here, this is in common. And even though this is different, like, it's nothing to fight about. Like, there's, even the differences create common ground. We can talk about them. So I think, like, Thomas Merton is a fantastic place for people to start. Who I think one reason I like Merton is he was absolutely a mystic, but he also wrote wonderful books on contemplative spirituality and was a contemplative as well. So he's a great sort of both and. He's got writings that talk about the sort of nitty gritty of some of the disciplines as well as the big picture stuff. So for Merton, there's all kinds of places to start, depending on what you like. You can just kind of look around. Typically, I find myself steering people to one of two starting points for Merton. One is his autobiography that's called The 7-Story Mountain. Seven-Story Mountain. What's that?
That's the one I always tell people to read first.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, because that gives you like the... Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you find in that, Todd, that makes you indicate that as a starting point for people?
Well, just because it gives a good overview of his life and it lets you know where he's coming from. And so when you read that first, then you read the other stuff. It contextualizes everything else you read about him, and you kind of know where the dude's coming from. And it reminds you, like, when you read other things, it reminds you of some of those stories, of some of those, like, his personality comes across in that book more than other books, I think. In a way where you just fall in love with the dude. And then when he says things, like he has this quirky kind of personality when he says things in other books, you're just like, oh, that crazy dude, right? And It makes really, like, that book really made me, like, really fall in love with the dude, which then brought meaning and even patience. Like, sometimes you have to have patience when you read certain people, but if you like them already, it's easier to have patience with what they're saying, or if you disagree with them. Like, disagreeing with someone you like is a lot different from disagreeing with someone you don't know or you don't think that you like. And so I think that book does the best job for me to really like him. And then once I like him, then I'm buying what he's selling the rest of the way.
Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, I find the same thing. I'd actually read some other things from Merton first, and then I went back and picked up 7-Story Mountain, and I kind of feel the same way. I'm like, oh, I wish I'd started here, exactly. Because then when I went back and reread some of those things, and it just went, oh, I mean, it really does read differently, knowing the story. So yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's just a marvelous work in spiritual writing.
Yeah,
and the honesty of the spiritual journey, and that's what we're talking about, and all this stuff. Mysticism and contemplative spirituality is really all about making that journey. And so it's nice to read somebody. And you're right, I mean, he's really honest about, it's not always a hero's tale.
Right.
It's the real stuff.
And it shows his doubts, and it shows his, it just makes you relate to him so much. What's the other one that you would say?
Yeah, and then the other one, because quite often, I don't know, quite often it seems as though I end up talking about Merton in the context of contemplative spirituality. And so the other one I tend to guide people to is what I think is his best work on really exploring and laying out the foundation for what contemplative prayer and contemplative spirituality looks like. And it's actually a revision that he made of an earlier book. And so the one I recommend is that revision. It's called New Seeds of Contemplation. So the old one was Seeds of Contemplation. I recommend the new Seeds of Contemplation. And it's just, I mean, he's got some other works that are great. Some other ones are probably meant more as a starting point. But I just think, if you're going to read one, like New Seeds of Contemplation, that book is one of the books that just kind of changed my life. It's just really good, and it's long enough that he really explores some things. It gives some big picture, it gives some practicalities. It's a wonderful book. That's
more of a how-to, right? And it's more like to do it. Like, it helps you do it, where the other one's more about him, and I feel like those are both really good. I think that's the first one I read of his.
The New Seeds?
Yeah. And I mean,
yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. But it's much more like, how do you do this? Then the other one's more like, here's my story, and it has a lot of stuff in it. Both of them have, they are similar in those ways, but one is much more about him, and one is much more about how to do, or how he does, what he does. Because he considered contemplation his vocation, which is super interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's that?
Now he struggles with that.
Yeah, absolutely. He does have a real slim book, in case somebody's really interested and gets into New Seeds, and just for whatever reason, because the time you're reading it or where you're at, it's just a little too much hard going for you. And timing is such an elusive thing. He's got a real slim little book that's just simply called Contemplative Prayer. And that one's pretty good too, and I've recommended that to people a couple times. It's much, much shorter, much simpler in approach. It is a little bit more of a how-to and practicality, and that one's much more focused, I guess, just on prayer. And so I would lift up that one too, just as a good introduction and starting point. If somebody wants a book that's real slim, I mean, you can knock that thing out, in a couple hours in an afternoon and be done with it. So yeah, maybe that one too.
Yeah, that's cool. What else? Any other things come to mind?
I'm really a believer in once you start down some of these roads, like I really am convinced you will find some of the other things that you need to read, and you'll end up in the places you need to go. I do think we talked last time about, some like the medieval Spanish mystics, like Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. I think there are some other, European ones that range from France to England and other places. Julian of Norwich is often talked about. Teresa of Lisieux is sometimes mentioned in that list. And I think, once you become a little familiar, you might not start with all those historic figures, but as you begin to dive in, at least for me, I was really kind of led back to some of those folks to fill in the blanks, just to get some of the contours, to sort of see, where the road has gone and what some of the differences are. Even with great modern writers like Merton, there are just some really ways in which, especially those Spanish mystics, Teresa and St. John of the Cross, it's just hard to find equivalent books before or since. I mean, they really stand out in history, and I'm not alone in that. I mean, that's why Dark Night of the Soul is a common phrase for us, and that's completely because of St. John of the Cross's book, which is also, by the way, his book doesn't have to do with what we mean when we say you're having a dark night of the soul. That was not what he was into at all. I mean, it doesn't have to do with that, but still, the phrase is so captivating that we use it. And so I think, eventually most people, as they make this journey, end up back at some of those old spiritual masters, just because there's nothing else quite like them.
Yeah.
I think, especially as we begin to get into some of the disciplines, I think there are some names that are so tied to specific disciplines that they sort of end up on the list. I mean, I could name a couple of those now, but I think we'll revisit them as we get into specific practices. So like, for example, one that I think of in that context would be Ignatius of Loyola, who has a book called Spiritual Exercises. And it's really a very practical thing. Quite often, it's better if you find somebody that knows how to administer the exercises and actually do a retreat and have them lead you through them, because it's a little different being led through them than it is just reading his, because they really do feel a little alien and dated when you just straight read through them. But he's one that's really tied to a couple specific practices out of those exercises. And he too has, a fascinating sort of life story. He was a soldier and very uninterested in religion and very interested in sort of what you can get out of life in terms of, violence and sex and all that. I mean, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He was kind of the originator of that. And got injured with a cannonball, and basically that ended his career. And so he lays up for months, and during those months has this profound spiritual experience of God and comes out a completely transformed person. Wow. And ends up creating these spiritual exercises. The Jesuit order in Catholic clergy, the Society of Jesus, is it all comes from Ignatius of Loyola. He started that whole thing, and that's where they come from. And when we get into the exercises, there's both what's called the examen, which is a time-honored practice. I'm sure we'll talk about that, and we'll give some more details at a later point, I'm sure, that comes from his writings. And also, there's a whole practice in sort of using our imagination in prayer, imaginative prayer, which was really important for me as I embarked on this journey, really transformative. And when you mentioned prayer earlier, Todd, such a different way to pray than I've ever been taught. And I got that from reading Ignatius, and it just, again, sort of blew the door open for me in terms of what prayer can be and what we can do with that, and how God might speak to us through prayer, and how it's been, especially for more creative types, to really use our imagination in prayer, which I don't think anybody had ever told me, I could do or that I should do in prayer. And Ignatius of Loyola had this whole invitation to really engage our creativity and our imagination in prayer, with scripture, and just a really, for me, a really transformative way to pray. And so, too much for today, but I look forward to revisiting Ignatius of Loyola and looking at some of his practices. And so, for the people that like to get ahead, on their homework, who strange people, and know what we're going to talk about down the road, you could check out some of his story and some of his work.
Yeah, that's cool.
And he also has some beautiful prayers that end up getting used in the exercises that just stand alone. So that's also, Ignatius is good to check out just for some of these wonderful prayers that he wrote, that I still like revisit and use from time to time, because they're very, very different from the way a lot of people pray. So.
Well, that's cool. That's very cool. I had a couple of things, and I don't know. So this is where I'm starting. But I took that class on Thomas Merton, and obviously, like in seminary, I had, some overviews of some of this stuff. So I'm not really coming in blind, really, but I am, practically speaking. And so when I was first starting to get curious about this like a year ago, there's some people on Facebook talking about spirituality. We talked about the retreat we went on, and we, kind of learned some of that stuff. Around that time, I was like, well, what's a good thing to start with? And there's this book by Alexander Shimon, For the Life of the World. Somebody told me that this is, have you read this? Or have you heard of that?
No, I don't know that one, huh?
Somebody told me this is like the best book to start with. And I kind of started it a while back, but I need to start it again because I don't remember anything I read about it. But I've been trying to kind of take notes, and my practice on study. So Richard Foster talks about study. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, I need to start this again, but this is one of the ones I'm going to kind of start with because it just kind of by chance kind of happened. Like you said, like sometimes the books find you, or like that whole idea of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear or whatever, very Mr. Miyagi, which I love. Which that show, have you watched that new Karate Kid show on Netflix?
I watched a little bit of it. Yes, I confess.
It's pretty, man. It's pretty good. It's very reminiscent. It really takes you back to the. I watched all of it. Super good. So,
I realize there's a lot that has nothing to do with spirituality, except, well, maybe it does. I realize there's a lot that's marketed to my kids theoretically, but it's really marketed to them through me because it's my nostalgia factor, and I'm grateful. I mean, I have no problem with that.
Yeah, exactly. I love it, man. I love it. And they show like little clips of the movie and stuff. You're like, oh God, it's so good, so good.
Yeah. Star Trek Lower Decks right here. Star Trek Lower Decks. Yeah, I'm into. The whole 9 yards, man. Can't do wrong.
This is one that I'm going to start with just because it kind of found me, I guess. I guess you could say so. So I'm going to kind of mess with that. And then I don't know where I got this book. I think somebody gave this to me too, and there's not a name in it, but I think a friend of mine's husband gave this to me, called The Naked Now, by Richard Rohr. He either gave me this or a different Richard Rohr book, but somehow I got this book. And as I was moving some stuff around the other day, I found it, and it says, Learning to See as the Mystics See. And it was like, oh, there we go. I've been looking for something to start with. So I started reading this this week. And so I want to kind of talk about two things. The first thing is that in Richard Foster's book about the idea of different spiritual practices, one of them is study, that idea of study and studying things. And I have this kind of personality that likes to finish things, right? Like I just like to get them done. I don't like to leave things hanging or halfway done. And when I was a kid, if my family was doing a puzzle and it was time to go to bed or whatever, like I would wait for everyone to go to sleep. I would get up with the flashlight and like work on the puzzle, try to finish the puzzle, because it like drove me nuts, to not have that thing done. And so there's something for me that I want to finish the chapter or finish the book or whatever, just to kind of get it done. But that isn't necessarily the best way to do everything, right? And for me, a good spiritual practice is to not finish things, not to leave them unfinished on purpose, but to leave them unfinished at least temporarily, and to be okay with that, and to kind of let some stuff go and to kind of practice. So within this idea of studying, that idea of kind of letting go, and that's kind of spiritual practice of not needing to be at the end of a chapter, or like, I don't know, that's kind of OCD of me. I don't have a lot of that in my life, I don't feel like, but I do about certain things. And so I've been doing this thing that I heard about called reading for revelation. And so what I do is I just read until something's revealed to me, right? It could be a page, it could be 5 pages, whatever. And then I just stop and I just write it down, or I make a note of it, or I put it in a journal, or, text message, or I text it to someone, whatever. I make a record of it. And so that's what I've been doing. And that way, if I can do that every day, I don't have to read a chapter a day, right? Because sometimes I don't have time to read a whole chapter. But, at least once a day, I can read until I get something out of it. And then when I get something out of it, I stop and I write it down, that I remember that thing that I got out of it. Because if I read a whole chapter and then went on with my day, even if I did that every day, I would have like a ton of information in my head right now, and I wouldn't know what to talk to you about this. But because I only did it like 2 or 3 days this week, and because I'm gonna do better this next week, and because like I really did just read until I learned something. Like I'm able to talk about what I actually got out of it, you know. And to me, even if it takes me longer to get through books, doing it every day means I'm learning something new every day, and I'm making a note of that thing every day, you know, and kind of keeping a record of that, so I can go back and see all the stuff that I'm learning when I want to later on, kind of like making memoirs. And so so that was super helpful to me, just that idea, and it takes a lot less time, right? And I used to have like as much time or more sometimes writing down what I've learned than what I actually am reading, and that makes books take longer, but like I'm learning a lot more out of the stuff that I'm reading. So that's a practice I've been doing right now. And
yeah, and I think, I mean, that's really, I mean, it's cool in so many ways that you bring that up, Todd. I know like our plan is next time we do one of these, we're going to start venturing into some of the specific disciplines, and we had picked Lectio Divina as the first one to get into, and so I mean, so next time we get together with everybody, we'll talk about Lectio Divina. But I mean, what's really cool about what you just said, Todd, it's a great segue into that, because one of the big things about like the classical practice of Lectio Divina, which is what I think we should restore and hold on to, is totally that premise. Like even in Scripture, you read until the Spirit like shows you something or pushes you on something or something stands out, and then you stop. Like, and that's so different. That was different from like the quiet time that I grew up on, or the proliferation of, you know, plans to read through the Bible in 1 year. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's some kind of high spiritual goal. Like I'm going to get through that whole Bible in a year. And what I've learned now is like, stop. I mean, what are you after in just reading through the Bible in 1 year? And I'm not trying to discount that for people for whom that's like an important discipline. That's great. But I do think there's a lot of things we do that we're hoping will be spiritual, and yet we never stop or slow down enough to ask, wait, what's the spiritual thing that's supposed to be happening here? Like, you know, and I think it's far more spiritual on the Lectio Divina side of what you're talking about in terms of study, and that study for revelation, Todd, which is, no, and what we're trying to do, right back to that prayer I started with from Thurman, right? God, open to me. You take the initiative, God. You open it. You show me. And so it seems to me, in terms of spirituality and transformation, we are far better off reading until God says, hey, over here. Hey, here's a word. Hey, pay attention to this. There's something here. Stopping and giving that some time, not just to keep reading just to check the box or get through, you know, a certain chapter so we can meet our reading plan or whatever it is we're trying to do. I'm not in this for a reading plan, not anymore. I'm not trying to get through so many chapters in a concise amount of time. I no longer feel like I'm not doing a good thing if I don't read, you know, 5 chapters every day for a week. I know the spiritual thing is, if there's one day in which I'm reading and God shows me something and I stop long enough to pay attention to it and to think about it and to hold on to it and allow that to work its way through, that's worth a week spent on those other things.
Yeah.
I think there's something really huge about that. I look forward to talking some more about that and talking about some more of the discipline around that. And what I also love about Lectio Divina is sort of, okay, as that's beginning to happen, like, what do you do with that now? Like, how do you, writing it down is one way, but like, what else do you spiritually to sort of move that along, deepen it, explore it? And then, of course, if you're doing these disciplines in a group, then the opportunity to share some of those things, to accept that from somebody else, and then to comment in turn, never for correction. We'll talk about that next time, but never to prove who's right, never to educate, but simply to try to encourage, each other in spiritual depth and exploration and what that can mean. And even hearing, what you're studying, what your revelation says to me, and to have a chance to overhear that and to say, like, oh wow, like that has some resonance with me. There's something deep. I need to think about that now. I think there's a. It's funny. Did you ever read that book, Slow Church?
Oh, I read parts of it.
Yeah, and just this whole idea that our culture is so fast, and even the way we do church and spirituality, we're just constantly accelerating to kind of keep up with culture around us. And this whole idea that maybe that doesn't really produce much spiritual good, just to do everything faster. And so, just these different ways to have disciplines that really work the counterweight for us and to get us to slow down and be like, what if you don't finish?
Yeah.
Why don't you let that go? Why don't you spend some time on a word that's for you and that'll actually, take you to some deeper places? And really, contemplation, that word, right, is all about slowing down and giving space and breath for that focus on something.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like, when's the last time, like, if you do that every day, you're reflecting, right, and like exploring 7 things a week. Like, when's the last week that I've explored 7 things? Like I don't. And intentionally explored 7 ideas a week. You do that. You intentionally explore 28, or 30 a month. Like, you're doing 30. You're learning 30 things every month. I mean, that's crazy. Like, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to really digest and remember, and to explore. And so if you just do that little thing every day, you're really getting a lot more bang for your buck. You're getting a lot more out of the time that you're putting into it than just trying to get content and just read a bunch of stuff. And part of me really is drawn to that too, because that's, I don't know if this is true or if this is an excuse, but that was the reason that I would turn things late in all the time, because I would just be digesting all of the stuff that in the classes I liked, like philosophy courses, a lot of my seminary courses. Like, I would just be like enveloped in. I remember a sociology of religion class I took in college. I like followed this dude around as speaking engagements and like read everything that this guy did and got obsessed with it. And I barely passed the class because I didn't go because I was on the road following this dude, and I like stopped reading all the assigned stuff, and I got really into this stuff this guy was writing. And so, like, I was still learning a lot about the subject, but it wasn't what was on the syllabus. But there's something to me that's about, like, I want to learn, I want to digest what I'm interested in and what's speaking to me. So part of me really is drawn to that too. And so I'm trying to focus on the part of me that's drawn to that instead of just like, getting as much content in as possible. And so I really like that idea, and I didn't know it had anything to do with that, with Lectio Divina, and so that's really cool. I look forward to talking about that, next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I really do find there's a lot in mystical Christianity and contemplative Christianity and spirituality that is, truly countercultural, and less about the glamour that some people find in, being countercultural. And countercultural to the level of, hey, John, even the culture that you absorb, like, I'm going to mess with that because, we can be, we can fancy ourselves, developed in all kinds of different ways, but we're still snagged by all those cultural assumptions, our own productivity, our own, sort of checklists. Our self-worth is still so hung up in what we do or achievement. So much of that is still, I said earlier about other people's expectations, and how for a long time that really charted the course for my own spiritual practice. And we're so hung up in those things. And I would argue inside of church, those things are not less powerful, they're even more powerful. And I suspect you've found the same things, Todd, and probably some of our listeners have found those same things. And maybe that's why, some of you have struggled with church, because you realize, in some ways church is countercultural, but in in other ways, it sort of backs up the detrimental side of the human experience when it should be doing the opposite. But I think, that's not what deep spirituality is trying to do. Deep spirituality is always very different from that, and will help us get free from that, those tendencies and those temptations. And when push comes to shove, almost always you end up in contemplative work coming back to that whole understanding of just how much stuff ends up being about selfishness and being self-centered, and even how we define ourselves. And so much in the contemplation is I would say the power, and really it's divine power in my understanding, but the power to finally not be driven by those other things.
Yeah.
Right. I don't have to produce. I don't have to hit that checklist. I don't have to get X number of chapters done to be a good person or a good Christian, whatever that means. I can't earn God's love. I don't have to do these certain things for God to be with me. And as we start to then let ourselves free from those things, man, it's so liberating. And then we get together and do things like this, Todd, because, for me, I found those things to be helpful. Even when I'm not good at it, I've still been able to tap into the liberating power of these movements of the Spirit. And I really want that for others because I know the difference it makes. I know what happens when we're set free from some of those self-expectations of, productivity and being defined by what we do and whether or not we do what other people want us to do, which is part of what I hear you talking about, right? And man, it's just such a more robust way of life to start to get out from under those things and even ourselves. And I think, a lot of what we're talking about and what we're going to talk about gets at those things, how to unseat those things, how to find freedom from those things, how to find different definitions of ourselves, how to see ourselves differently, and then by extension, see other people differently. And then that begins to shape our action and the way that we treat other people, and really does lead to a transformed life and a transformed world. But until we start to let go of some of those things, if I'm boundaried by productivity, then that's what I expect out of other people.
Yeah.
And that's objectifying people, turning people into cogs in the machine. If I can't get free of that, how can I look at people differently? I have to get free from that stuff. When I see myself differently, then I'm free to see people in that different way and to advocate for that difference in their life and to want that for them, and then be part of seeing that happen. And I think that, ultimately that's, I think all this stuff is part of Christianity because as I read the Gospels, that's what Jesus was doing. Yeah. And so this is just a recovery of some of those foundational ways that the church does the work of the Christ in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, sorry, I probably went too far into that, but
it's really. I think that if you want to think of a final thought here, I'm going to share a final thought here.
That might have been mine. I think that counts for mine. So you go ahead and do. I don't think I can do better than what I just did. So can that be my final thought? Is that okay? But yeah. I want to hear yours, man.
Absolutely. I just want to talk. So I learned two major things this week. One is that I'm going to wait to read that first book until I have a community to read it in. The other thing that I learned came from the introduction here of this book, The Naked Now, by Richard Rohr. First he talks about, he has this sentence, he says, he said, why have we told people they must believe in God in order to experience God, when God is clearly at work in many ways that the eyes have not seen or the ears have not heard, nor has it entered into our minds? And that was an idea that really stuck with me today, is that we ask a lot of people to believe before they belong, right, into our communities. And we judge people in their experience with God. We discount people's experiences with the divine if they don't believe the same things we do. And so we really put this lens of belief before this lens of experience, when I think that it really can go the other way around. And that's what can really lead to good conversations with people that believe different things, is that if we have similar experiences, you can talk about those experiences and have conversations about that. And then you can then flesh out beliefs from there. But beliefs come second, according to Richard Rohr, and I really like that. And then, he quotes 1 Corinthians 2:9, that, that's where some of that comes from. The idea of the eyes have not seen, the ears have not heard, nor has it entered into our minds, right? And Jesus, even practically, when Jesus goes to the disciples and he tells them, before they're the disciples, to follow him. He doesn't say, believe this or believe that. And he just says, hey, put down your nets, follow me, and he tells other people, follow. Like, the whole idea is just following Jesus, which means walking with Jesus, traveling with Jesus, experiencing the things with Jesus that he's experiencing together with each other in community. And so those experiences came first, and it was like way later, like before, like not that soon before Jesus died, when Jesus asked the disciples, like, well, who do you say that I am? Who do people say that I am? Then who do you say that I am? Right? And that's the closest thing to belief, right? That Jesus kind of gets to is, who do you believe that I am? Who do you say that I am? And even that's a little nuanced, but I like that idea of belonging before believing, and I think that's always been, that's been a theological conversation for a long, long time. But in this book, it really kind of explores that. And then it says that the overall message of this book is that all saying must be balanced by unsaying, and all light must be informed by darkness. And I thought those are two. I mean, obviously, there's the whole rest of this book to talk about that, but those things really, stuck with me this week.
Yeah, it as you talked about the follow me, I thought about it jogged my memory in John's gospel. The first several encounters Jesus has with people that are going to follow him, his response is, "Come and see."
Oh yeah.
Right? So it's very similar, a little different nuance, but
yeah.
That even stacks up even more interesting with, the eye has not seen. Jesus is like, "Come and take a look."
Right.
Like, and it's even, right, that's even more welcoming than the follow me.
Right.
Because for John, it's like, I'm not even asking you to follow yet. Let's just, come over here, get close, and take a look.
Right.
And you can decide from there.
Right.
That's what that made me think of. And then even like the darkness and the light, that's huge in John's gospel.
Yeah.
The whole come and see, see for yourself, have the experience. Yeah, I think that's huge. I know. Yeah. I know you and I have talked about the believe and belong thing a bunch of times, but I think this is, like an outgrowth of that. Yeah, I really resonate with that. I think there's really something to that.
It's something really interesting to explore that you just made me think of. Is I've been taking a lot of business classes, and not classes, but looking a lot of business, watching a lot of business videos and things like that, and just stuff that I can find online about trying to be better at business, having a better business mind, and thinking about things to help kind of promote these things and look at the business side of the church and try how to be successful. And a lot of people talk about funnels, right? And it's like this, and it's this idea of how you get people, and then you get them to go deeper and deeper and deeper, into buying your product more and more. So you have different things, different levels of things to kind of sell them, but you kind of start out for free or really cheap, then you funnel them into like your deeper product, right? And there's a guy that, one of the founders of ClickFunnels, big company, I've heard him talk a lot lately and do some seminars and different things. And it just, when you say that, like Jesus was totally using that idea. And I think it'd be super interesting. Like if anybody's writing a dissertation out there or something, I think it'd be super interesting to write about how Jesus used funnels, right? The same way we use funnels now, but people are taking this idea that really Jesus exemplified, 2,000 years ago about how to get people in, or a road of discipleship, or whatever we want to call it in church. But it's very similar to these funneling ideas that businesses are using like crazy right now, especially online business. And so, I mean, that's a really long final thought, but it just made me think of that. Because come and see, it's like, okay, oh, come and see. Oh, then you want to get more involved. Oh, okay, now you got to do this. Oh, now you do this. Oh, come and we'll heal. Now you heal people, right? Like Jesus, like totally, like, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm cast out demons. Oh, now you cast out demons. Oh, okay, now I'm going to take up my cross, and then you're going to take up your cross, right? And then, like, the way that Jesus just gets people in deeper and deeper and deeper with that idea, and it all starts with come and see. And if you have a legitimate, I mean, that's what I've been learning, is if you have a legitimate product, you have a legitimate business opportunity and something to serve people with, and this is business people talking, it's not even church people talking, but if you have something legitimate to serve people with, then they're going to see, and then they're going to want to get involved. And you have to be confident in that. And Jesus was. And I think that's just a super, I don't know, I just made that connection. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that's really cool too, Todd. And I think, our topic, I mean, also aligns with that, because I really think the sort of contemplative practice, contemplative spirituality, a more contemplative approach to our Christianity really is part of that funnel. I think that's a pretty good metaphor that we miss because it's not overt, but it's because it's not in Jesus, sort of basic invitation to people. It's not that it's not part of it. It's definitely woven into the Gospels, into Christian spirituality. But I think it's a piece of the funnel a little bit later on. And I mean, certainly in my life, and this, is held in common with lots and lots of other people that have walked down this road, right? Like, man, when I started seminary, I wasn't ready for this. And we talked about that, I think, last time, right, Todd, that we both took classes on this in seminary. And like 20 years later, I'm like, oh, now I'm ready to make use of that stuff. Because there's no way in those 20 years I was going to bother with it. It just wasn't. It wasn't the right timing.
And that's not taught in mainstream Christianity. I mean, that's not what, we talk about the Romans road to salvation, and once saved, always saved, and the sinner's prayer and things like, right, like boom, like you're done. Like now you're good. Now just go do your thing. And, this idea of this funnel makes me think of sanctifying grace. It makes me think about, going deeper and this idea of mysticism and spirituality is even more depth, right? As you get in more and more, then you get ready for these bigger things, like exactly what you're talking about. And I think that's a really cool. It's not a business trick, like really. It's just legitimately how people are built and created, meaning that God is maybe that way too, if we're in that image, right?
Yeah, and I think whatever shape or metaphor you want to use. I mean, I think the whole spiral dynamics piece, is a slightly different metaphor and a different shape, but it's actually articulating the same developmental piece. Yeah, right. It just sees it as an upward spiral instead of a funnel down. It's using height instead of depth, but really it's all the same thing. Concentric circles. I mean, there's right, spiritual people and business people have all these different ways of conceiving of it, but it's all the same thing, just looked at from a different direction. But I think there's, because it's universally the way we articulate things, there is something to this. Absolutely, right? And it's the way nature is, and it's the way, right? Everything works that way, and that's not an accident. And we shouldn't be rebelling against these things. We should be learning from each other. And and getting these things and helping to understand, from each other, rather than being so, it's our way or the highway, which I think we get ourselves in a corner, paint ourselves in a corner like that a lot of times, and then we alienate ourselves from things that could really help us. Yeah, I think so. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, John. And next week we will, or I guess next month, we'll be talking. And we're going to do these once a month for a while. Then maybe we'll start to do them a little more often. But we're gonna post these once a month for a while, just to make sure that we have enough. We have things built up enough, because all of our schedules are kind of crazy. But if we start getting ahead on some of these, then we'll start posting them more often, and maybe twice a month at some point.
And so, but anyway, if you join us next month, we'll talk more about this, and we'll get more into the Lectio Divina and the next episode, and we will talk more about our journey. And until then, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to hit us up. And the links will be below on the YouTube. And if there's a way to do that on the podcast channel, we'll do that too. But on the website too, X-ile.com, all this will be available on X-ile.com, and we'll have links and the YouTube videos shared there. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being here with us.